All right, golfers, I want to talk a little bit about alignment here and not just this idea of everybody needs to align straight. That is extremely flawed. I'm going to tell you from the beginning, it couldn't be further from the truth. There is no such thing as a stock alignment for everybody. Some people need to aim close, some people need to aim open, some people need to aim straight. My goal here is to get you guys to understand the matchups that take place when you change your alignment and what is being influenced. And I'm going to use a stick here through my two front belt loops as a visual, okay? So what ends up happening oftentimes is if I'm going to align myself straight, what you're going to notice is that relative to, let's say, my target, my hip structure is going to be pointing right at it, right? So my alignment, let's just assume for this is dead straight. Well, if I am going to open up my hips, let's say 45 degrees in the backswing from here, well, that means pretty simple. My trail hip, so for me, that's my right hip, is going to get 45 degrees behind me. As a culmination to that, let's say my arms are coming back at an equal rate. My arms will get backwards behind me 45 degrees. Pretty simple, right? I'm starting at 0 because my alignment is square. I'm opening up my hips. I'm deep 45 degrees into the hip. My arm structure 45 degrees behind me, assuming that they're at an equal rate, right? Well, what happens when I shift my alignment open? So for me as a right-handed player, that would be to my left. Well, if I am square here and I'm at 0 degrees and I opened up 45, everything gets to 45. Well, if I open up my alignment here, let's say I open it up 15 degrees, right? Well, now what's happening is my left hip is getting this way by 15 degrees. My right hip is actually getting in front of me by 15 degrees, right? This trail hip is actually moving in front of me by 15 degrees, assuming that's the exact amount I opened up my alignment, right? So I'm starting at 0. I opened up my alignment by 15 degrees. My right hip is now in front of me by 15. Well, if my range of motion of how much I can open up my hips remains 45 degrees and that doesn't change, well, now if I open up my hips 45 degrees, I'm only at 30 degrees of depth, right? That's the math. I'm starting from a position of negative 15 because my back hip is actually in front of me by 15 degrees. If I open up 45, I'm now at 30 degrees of depth with the back hip. I'm at 30 degrees of arm structure, again, assuming they're constant, right? Well, what does that mean? Well, what that means is if I open up my alignment and I now get into the loading pattern with the exact same amount as what I started with when my feet line was square, my arm structure is now going to be 15 degrees less deep than they were when my alignment was square. So at square, I opened up 45. My arm structure was at 45. But if I take that same setup and now I open up my baseline by 15 degrees, well, my right hip is moving in front of me 15 degrees, my right shoulder is moving in front of me 15 degrees. If I open up the same amount of 45, I'm only going to be at 30 degrees of depth relative to the target line. I'm only going to be at 30 degrees of depth with my arms as well relative to the target line. Well, what that means is I'm not as far behind me with the variables, meaning I am going to swing less from the inside when I open up my baseline. Now, the opposite can be said, obviously, if you close your alignment. So if me as a right-handed golfer, again, let's say I'm at 0, and now let's say we're going to do the inverse. So I'm actually going to close my alignment by 15 degrees, right? Well, now what's happening is my right hip is actually more behind me by 15 degrees, meaning if I also rotate by the same amount of 45, now my arms and my hips are going to be 60 degrees open relative to the target line because I'm not starting at 0, I'm starting at 15 because I'm already behind me with the hip by 15 degrees. If I open up the same range of motion of 45, now this hip is 60 degrees behind me, the arms are 60 degrees behind me. Guess what? I'm going to swing a lot more from the inside, right? And so when you are shifting your alignment to the right, people automatically think like, oh, you're guaranteed going to swing from the inside, but people don't necessarily understand the math behind it. I just want to give some clarity into that of saying, look, there actually is math to support this. Obviously, we're talking all these numbers relative to the target, assuming that your target doesn't change, right? And so there are some players who swing very inside out and they're very, very deep with the hand path and all of that, and they're coming down too far from the inside. You can make swing changes in theory if the flaw is actually within the golf swing itself. You could also set up square and then actually open up your baseline relative to the target by a certain amount. And what that will do is if you load the same way and you come down, all of a sudden you're not going to be nearly as deep with the hands. You're not going to be nearly as behind you with the club. You'll actually swing a little more neutral into the golf ball. And you'll see a guy like Rory do this with his driver quite a bit. He tends to align himself a little bit open with his driver stance. What he's doing is he's offsetting how far inside out he would theoretically swing. So if he was square, he would actually be swinging really aggressively from the inside. But because he opens his baseline relative to the target and he still swings down the target line, Well, all of a sudden, he's not nearly as deep into the hip. He's not nearly as flat with the arm structure, and he doesn't swing so far from the inside. All of a sudden, he can hit relatively straight balls. So if you are somebody who's too outside in, too inside out, you can play around with the alignment. Obviously, we look within the golf swing typically to see if some issues are actually within the swing itself. If the issues are not necessarily a swing problem, but everything is rolling pretty good, but obviously your path is a little too much in one direction or another, you can actually straighten that out or play around with it if you understand the math behind changing your alignment relative to the target line, okay?